prefer to imagine royalty clothed in silks, drinking wine in gilded halls, above the laws that bind the rest of us. What then, when kings rise up against kings, when queens betray empires, when the highborn fall out of favor, is their gilded station no longer a shield? The truth is, in the past, royalty has always been punished, not because their crimes were worse, but because their bloodlines were too sacred to be punished like anyone else. And sometimes the punishments were even more humiliating, for they weren't just about pain, they were about destroying a legacy. Let us open the doors of the palace and gaze upon the darker face of noble justice. One of the most prevalent features of royal punishment was the demand for dignity, even in death. The preferred punishment of European nobles was decapitation. Why? It was believed to be quick, relatively painless, and honorable. It was considered that a noble person should not suffer the long agony of hanging or burning like a commoner. Dignity, however, did not necessarily entail mercy. Consider Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII. She stood accused, perhaps unfairly, of incest and adultery. Her penalty? Death by beheading at the hands of a French swordsman who was imported specially to allow her to die more dignifiedly. No axe, no ritual, steel and silence alone. But the cruelty was not only in the act, but also in the psychological anguish in advance. Anne knew for days that she was going to die. She heard the preparations, saw her household being dismantled, and had to live with the awareness that her death was a political gesture, masquerading as royal tradition. Now compare that to Catherine Howard, another wife of Henry VIII, who was also beheaded, just not with the same solemn precision. She screamed for mercy all the way to the block. Even among queens, status dictated the style of death. When royals were not put to death, they were often imprisoned in gilded cages. Think of Mary, Queen of Scots, under house arrest in various English castles for 19 years until she was eventually executed. Her punishment wasn't an issue of blood. It was an issue of erasure. She was removed from politics, silenced, and gradually overshadowed by the march of time for nearly 2 decades as the world continued on. This was nothing out of the ordinary. China's Empress Dowager Cixi jailed her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, when he tried to reform the Qing dynasty. He was emperor in name, but lived and died in jail under her regime, a figurehead in exile. Chains were not necessary to jail royalty. Silence would suffice. Obscurity was the greatest punishment. Exile was the solution, but not just any exile. Nobles were often exiled to monasteries or convents. This was especially customary in the medieval Christian and Byzantine worlds. By banishing a deposed ruler to a monastery, the crown could achieve some safety from public bloodshed in removing a threat. They couldn't plot from behind cloistered walls, and once having taken the vows, there was no going back. Irene of Athens, for example, ruled the Byzantine Empire in her own right, but when she was deposed, she was exiled to the island of Lesbos and forced into a religious life of seclusion. The former supreme woman of the empire died poor and unknown. The punishment wasn't physical, it was existential, a life surrounded by ceremony and courtiers now bounded by silence, prayer, and the distant recollection of power. At royal courts, appearances were everything. Fashion wasn't just fashion, it was status. So when an aristocrat fell out of favor, their humbling would begin with symbolic degradation. A queen might have her regal robes ripped from her body in the town square. A prince might be shaved bald, a deeply humiliating act in cultures as diverse as ancient Persia and medieval Europe, where long hair had symbolized nobility and manhood. It was not a random act. It was intentional. It meant you are not who you once were. You are nothing now. Even at the imperial court of Japan, emperors or nobles forced to abdicate would take the tonsure, shaving their heads and becoming monks. The transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was a public mark of shame. Execution was risky business when the victim was a royal. The spectacle could create martyrs or spark rebellion, so poison became the secret instrument of royal punishment. In Mughal India, for instance, Poisoning was sometimes used to get rid of a noble rival or an inconvenient prince silently and without political fuss. One of the most famous cases was that of Ivan VI of Russia, a child emperor who was incarcerated for the majority of his life by Empress Elizabeth. His guards, under orders, quickly murdered him when a group tried to free him. Some sources report poison was used so that it would be quiet and not be discovered. The two-stage punishment here is a life of invisible imprisonment, followed by a death that no one witnessed, no trial, no last words, silence. In feudal Japan, a lord who had lost honor, a samurai especially, could be ordered or expected to perform seppuku, ritual suicide. This involved opening the belly and quite often having a second deliver a head-killing stroke. It sounds like a nightmare, and it was, but within their culture, it was the most honorable form of punishment, a means to remove shame and bring dignity back to one's family. Not even princes and emperors were exempt. In the case of Prince Arisugawa, his shame would have traditionally demanded seppuku, although modernization later changed those codes. The lines between salvation and punishment were blurred in these cases. Seppuku wasn't death. It was a statement of character. Punishment wasn't necessarily an issue of pain. Occasionally it was an issue of being made obsolete. Threatening royals could be given opulent palaces, wealth, and servants, but never freedom. Think of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was exiled to St. Helena after his final defeat. Not a palace, maybe, but he did live in some comfort, albeit totally cut off from the world. Or Ottoman princes, confined in the cafes, or cage of the Topkapi Palace. They were not tortured, but nor were they permitted to depart, marry, or rule. Some were there for 40 years. One prince ascended the throne after 40 years of solitude, emotionally destroyed, a special type of punishment. Slow rot, alive, but rotting. What all of these punishments teach us is that royalty never meant exemption. It meant visibility, and sometimes that simply made the fall all the worse. Rulers, queens, and emperors, they weren't above the law. They were the law, and when they violated that unwritten rule of royal behavior, the punishment was theatrical, symbolic, and oftentimes gruesome. And still, they were also calculated. The purpose wasn't just to punish the body. It was to annihilate the legacy, to erase the memory of defiance, to bring pride low, to remind the world that no one, regardless of the blueness of the blood, was beyond management. There's something unsettling in the way monarchs were punished, not always with violence, but with silence, with exile, with shame. It was not the sword that wounded most deeply. It was the feeling of having been forgotten, obliterated from history. And here we are, centuries later, still speaking their names. Royal punishments were never simply a question of law. They were a question of power, and in their failure, these kings and queens have something significant still to teach us, that the show of power is as crucial as power itself. If you like this foray into regal justice, thumbs up this video. It really makes our channel visible to more inquiring minds like yours. Have a favorite historical figure who was punished? Share their tale in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more deep dives into the dark, weird, and wondrous side of history. Your subscription keeps the past alive. Thanks for watching. And don't forget, history is not just what happened. It's what we choose to remember.